The smoke from the garage explosion was still settling, a heavy gray shroud that tasted of pulverized concrete and high-grade accelerants, when the atmosphere in the basement shifted from the frantic heat of a chase to something unnervingly cold. Kaelen lay pressed against the oily floor, his ears ringing with the dissonant hum of 1,000 bells, and his vision blurred by the acrid haze that stung his eyes like needles. He could hear the heavy, synchronized footfalls of the tactical team, the cleaners sent by the minister to reclaim the $5 billion he had dared to lock away. They moved with the terrifying confidence of men who knew their target was cornered, their red laser sights cutting through the darkness like digital surgical tools. Kaelen clutched the encrypted drive to his chest, the weight of the $5 billion deal feeling like a lead anchor dragging him into a lightless abyss. He had spent his entire life believing that power was found in numbers, in the elegant architecture of digital firewalls and the secure anonymity of offshore accounts. But as a heavy combat boot crunched onto the glass shards just inches from his head, he realized that in the physical world he was nothing more than a ghost in waiting. Then the red laser sights began to vanish. One by one, the crimson dots blinked out of existence, not because the soldiers had reached their target, but because they were being extinguished with terrifying, silent efficiency. There was no sound of return fire, no dramatic explosion to signal a counterattack, only the wet, heavy thud of armored bodies hitting the ground. It was a surgical erasure of life. Kaelen looked up through the swirling smoke to see a figure standing at the far end of the garage, framed by the flickering, stuttering glow of the emergency lights. Sloane didn't look like a soldier. She looked like an inevitability. She wore a black leather jacket that seemed to absorb the very light around her and moved with a fluid, haunting grace that suggested she wasn't fighting the shadows, but was an organic part of them. This was the woman who had caused intelligence agencies from D.C. to Beijing to rewrite their most secure protocols, the phantom operative whose name was a curse whispered in the halls of power. She stepped over the fallen body of a tactical captain, her expression one of detached professional boredom. A surviving mercenary, his eyes wide with a sudden primal panic, lunged from behind a concrete pillar with his knife gleaming in the half-light. Sloane didn't even break her stride. In a single blur-like motion, she parried the strike with a flick of her wrist, redirected the man's momentum to a palm strike to the chest, and sent him crashing into a concrete wall with enough force to crack the stone. She didn't look back to see if he was still breathing. She knew the exact anatomy of her own violence. To the governments that feared her, Sloane was a weapon of mass disruption, a legend that moved through sovereign borders as if they were made of mist. To Kaelen, she was the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave in the Busan harbor. "You're the one with the $5 billion, she said, her voice a low, steady vibration that cut through the silence of the morgue-like garage. It wasn't a question. She stopped exactly 3 paces from him, her eyes scanning the exits with a predatory focus that made Kaelen's skin crawl with an instinctive dread. He managed to scramble to his feet, his legs shaking so violently they felt like they were made of water, his hands still trembling as he held the drive like a holy relic. I froze the account," he stammered, his logical mind struggling to process the carnage she had just caused in less than 30 seconds. "They're going to send everyone, the police, the army, the minister's private guard. You're just one person." Sloane finally looked at him, and for a moment Kaelen felt the sheer crushing weight of her reputation. Her eyes weren't filled with anger or adrenaline. They were empty, reflecting a soul that had seen the rise and fall of empires and remained entirely unmoved. "The governments of 3 continents have tried to find me, Wu," she said, her tone as cold as the rain beginning to leak through the vents above. "They fear me because I don't follow their maps. I don't use their laws. I am the reason they keep their lights on at night." She reached out and gripped his shoulder, her touch firm and grounding. You hired me to get you out of Busan. If you want to live to see the sunrise, you stop talking about what they have and start doing exactly what I tell you." Kaelen looked at the bodies littering the floor, men who had been trained for years in special operations, neutralized in seconds by a woman who looked like she hadn't even broken a sweat. He realized then that the $5 billion wasn't the most dangerous thing in this garage. She was. As they moved toward the exit, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, a rising chorus of the city's fury. The hunt had officially begun, but for the first time since he had locked the deal, Kaelen felt a flicker of something other than pure, paralyzing terror. He was with the ghost of the world, and as they stepped out into the torrential Busan rain, he knew that the world was about to learn why she was the only woman the governments feared. The architect and the operative were now a team, and the city of Busan was about to become their battlefield. The rain hit them like a wall of ice, washing the soot and blood from Kaelen's ruined suit. He watched Sloane as she led him toward a matte black motorcycle parked in a dark alcove. She moved with a purpose that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Every step she took was calculated, every glance around a corner a tactical assessment. Kaelen felt like a child following a predator through a dark forest. He was a man who understood the world through spreadsheets and data points, but Sloane understood the world through the physics of motion and the biology of fear. As she swung her leg over the bike and gestured for him to get on, Kaelen realized that his life as the architect was over. He was no longer a man who built financial structures. He was about to watch a woman tear them down.
The motorcycle roared to life, a guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in Kaelen's very bones. He gripped Sloane's waist, his fingers digging into the leather of her jacket as she accelerated out of the garage and into the neon-lit chaos of the city. The wind whipped past them, carrying the scent of salt water and ozone. Behind them, the building they had just escaped was already swarming with flashing lights. Kaelen looked back once, seeing the silhouette of the high-rise where he had spent so many years building a life out of numbers. It looked small now, a glass cage that he had finally broken out of. "They'll be tracking your phone," Sloane shouted over the roar of the wind. "Throw it." Kaelen didn't hesitate. He pulled the expensive device from his pocket and watched it disappear into the darkness of the wet pavement. It was his last link to the world he knew, the world of $5 billion deals and corporate politics. Now he was off the grid, a ghost in the making. He looked at the drive in his other hand, the physical manifestation of the $5 billion secret. It was his only leverage, his only weapon. And as Sloane wove the bike through the narrow, rain-slicked streets of Busan, Kaelen knew that the hunt was only going to get more intense. The city dissolved into a frantic blur of colors and sound. Sloane navigated the motorcycle with a reckless precision, leaning into curves so steeply that Kaelen's heels grazed the asphalt. Every time a siren wailed or a set of headlights loomed in the mirror, she would find a new vein in the city's geography, a service road, a narrow alleyway, a pedestrian walkway to vanish into. Kaelen pressed his face against her back, the scent of leather and cold rain filling his senses. He was terrified, yes, but beneath the terror was a rising electric sense of freedom. He had spent his life managing assets for men who viewed him as a tool. Now he was an anomaly. He was the variable they couldn't control, protected by the person they couldn't catch. "Why me?" Kaelen shouted as they crossed a bridge over the Nakdong River. "Why did you answer the call?" Sloane didn't answer immediately. She gunned the engine, weaving between two transport trucks with inches to spare. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the screaming wind. "Because you did something stupid, Kaelen. You chose a side. Most people in your position just take the percentage and look the other way. You didn't. That makes you an asset worth preserving." Kaelen thought about the $5 billion. He thought about the minister's cold, calculated plan to sell out the city's future for a private kingdom. He hadn't chosen a side out of heroism. He had chosen it because the math didn't add up to anything he could live with. But to Sloane, that distinction didn't matter. He was a break in the pattern, and she was the one who operated in the fractures. They reached the edge of the industrial district, where the towering cranes of the port stood like skeletal sentinels against the night sky. Sloane pulled the bike into a sprawling scrapyard.
Weaving through mountains of rusted metal and discarded shipping containers, she killed the engine in the shadow of a massive freighter hull, and for the first time in an hour, the world went silent. The only sound was the rhythmic pinging of the cooling engine and the distant, mournful call of a foghorn. Kaelen dismounted, his legs nearly buckling under him. He leaned against the cold steel of a container, his chest heaving. Sloane was already on her feet, checking her surroundings with that same unsettling mechanical focus. She looked at him, then at the drive he was still clutching. The first rule of survival, architect, never let them see your fear. It's the only thing they can use to track you when the technology fails. He nodded, trying to slow his breathing. What now? Now we move to a secondary site, Sloane said, pulling a heavy tactical bag from a hidden compartment on the bike. The garage was just the start. The minister is going to realize that his cleaners didn't just fail, they were dismantled. He's going to escalate. He'll stop using professionals and start using the state. Martial law, citywide lockdowns, every camera in Busan will be looking for us. She handed him a dark, nondescript jacket and a ball cap. Change your silhouette. We're moving on foot through the docks. If we're lucky, we'll be out of the harbor zone before they finish sealing the bridges. Kaelen did as he was told, the reality of his situation sinking in deeper with every passing second. He wasn't just running from a mob boss or a corporate rival. He was running from the very infrastructure he had helped build. He was the architect of a prison, and now he was trying to climb the walls. As they walked through the maze of the shipping yard, Sloane began to explain the reality of the woman the world's governments feared. She didn't talk about her origins or her name. She talked about her philosophy. Every government thinks they are a solid structure, she said, her voice a low hum in the dark. They think they are built on laws and treaties, but they are actually built on secrets. I am the person who knows where the foundation is cracked. I don't need an army to bring them down. I just need to pull the right stone. Kaelen looked at her, seeing her not as a bodyguard, but as a surgeon of chaos. She wasn't just protecting him to keep the $5 billion away from the minister. She was protecting him because he was the stone he had accidentally pulled. They reached a small derelict pier where a beat-up fishing trawler was moored. A man in a heavy coat stood on the deck, smoking a cigarette that glowed like a single angry eye in the dark.
Sloane exchanged a few words with him in a language Kaelen didn't recognize, and the man gestured for them to board. "We're heading up the coast," Sloane said as she led him into the cramped, oil-scented cabin. "It's slow, it's dirty, and it's the only thing in this city that isn't connected to a central server. Get some rest, Wu. Tomorrow, the world starts looking for you in earnest." Kaelen sat on a narrow bunk, the $5 billion drive resting on the mattress beside him. He watched the lights of Busan fade into the mist as the boat pulled away from the pier. He felt a strange sense of displacement. He had lost everything, his career, his home, his identity. But as he looked at Sloane, who was currently cleaning her weapon with a meditative intensity, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. He felt relevant. The night on the trawler was long and cold. Kaelen drifted in and out of a shallow, uneasy sleep, his dreams filled with red laser sights and the sound of falling bodies. Every time he woke, Sloane was in a different position, sometimes at the window, sometimes checking the radio, sometimes just staring into the dark. She didn't seem to sleep. She seemed to exist in a state of perpetual readiness, a living weapon that never truly powered down.
When the sun finally began to bleed through the gray Busan fog, Sloane tapped him on the shoulder. "We're nearing the drop-off point. Wake up." Kaelen sat up, rubbing the grit from his eyes. He looked out the small porthole to see a jagged, rocky coastline. It looked like the end of the world. Where are we? A place where the minister's reach is short, and where we start the counteroffensive. She led him off the boat and onto a narrow, hidden beach. A battered 4x4 was waiting for them, the keys hidden in the wheel well. As they drove up a mountain road, Kaelen looked at the drive. The data on here, it's not just the 5 billion, it's the identities of the foreign investors, the names of the banks that were going to facilitate the coup. Sloane nodded, her eyes on the road. "I know. That's why you're still alive. You didn't just freeze the money, you froze the future they were building. And now we're going to make sure that future never happens." They reached a secluded cabin tucked into a pine-covered ridge. It was a fortress disguised as a getaway. Inside, the walls were lined with monitors, servers, and more tactical gear than Kaelen had seen in his entire life. This was the Ghost's nest. Sloane gestured to a high-end workstation. "You're the architect. Start building the bomb. I want every news agency, every whistleblower site, and every rival politician in the world to have a piece of that data by tomorrow. We don't just broadcast it, we shatter it so they can never put the secrets back together." Kaelen sat down, his fingers hovering over the keys. For the first time, he felt like he was in control. He wasn't just a man running from a hunt. He was the one who was going to end it. He looked at Sloane, who was standing by the door, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "One thing," Kaelen said. "If the world's governments fear you so much, why are you helping me? I'm just an accountant." Sloane turned, a faint, dangerous smile touching her lips. "Because, Kaelen, the world is full of people who take orders. It's very rare to find someone who actually looks at the numbers and says no. That's the kind of person who changes the world, and I've always been a fan of change." As Kaelen began to type, the first lines of code reflecting in his glasses, he knew that the war for Busan was over. The global war was just beginning. And with the ghost of the world at his side, he was ready to watch the minister's kingdom burn. The hours in the cabin blurred together. Kaelen worked with a feverish intensity, his logical mind finding its rhythm in the chaos. He wasn't just decrypting the $5 billion deal, he was weaving a narrative of corruption that was so dense and so undeniable that it would act as a digital guillotine. He felt Sloane's presence behind him, a silent, steady anchor in the storm of data. She didn't ask questions, she just watched, her silence a form of permission. Outside, the mountain air grew cold as the sun began to dip below the ridge. The tranquility of the cabin was a sharp contrast to the digital war Kaelen was waging. He could see the minister's countermeasures in the code, sophisticated firewalls, ghost servers, and aggressive tracking bots. But Kaelen was the architect. He knew how to hide a house in plain sight. He moved the data through a series of dead drop servers across 4 continents, ensuring that when the bomb went off, it couldn't be traced back to this ridge. "Almost there," Kaelen whispered, his eyes stinging from the blue light of the monitors. 10 minutes to global saturation. Sloane walked to his side, her gaze fixed on the progress bar. "Is the backup protocol ready?" "Yes. If they try to shut down one site, the data replicates to 10 others. It's a hydra. They can't kill it." Sloane reached out and touched the monitor, her fingers tracing the cascading lines of code. "Good. Then let's show the world what the minister is really buying for $5 billion.
Kaelen hit the final key. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the traffic monitors on his screen began to glow white. The data was moving. It was hitting the servers in London, New York, Tokyo, and Seoul. The $5 billion secret was no longer a secret. It was a headline. It was a scandal. It was a revolution.
Kaelen slumped back in his chair, a profound sense of exhaustion washing over him. He had done it. He had taken the most powerful man in Busan and rendered him powerless with a single keystroke. He looked at Sloane, expecting to see a reflection of his own relief. But Sloane wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at a secondary monitor that showed a thermal feed of the mountain road. Her expression was hard, her body already tensed for action. "They're here," she said, her voice a low, lethal command. Kaelen's heart dropped. "How? I blocked the trace." "They didn't trace the data, Wu. They traced the trawler. I told you, the minister stopped using professionals. He's using the military now. That's a tactical team in an armored transport. They aren't here to arrest us. They're here to level the cabin." She grabbed her tactical bag and tossed Kaelen a weapon. "The architect is done. Now we need the ghost." She moved to the door, her silhouette framed by the flickering monitors. "This is the part where the governments really learn to fear me, because when they try to burn me out, I make sure they're the ones who go up in flames." Kaelen stood up, the weapon heavy in his hand, the $5 billion drive still in his pocket, empty now, but a reminder of the weight he had carried. He looked at Sloane, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He was part of the inevitability. "Let's go," Kaelen said. As they stepped out into the cold night air, the sound of the approaching transport echoing through the pines, Kaelen realized that the story of the most hunted man in Busan was over. The story of the duo that broke the world had just begun. And as the first flashbang grenade lit up the forest, Sloane stepped into the light, a phantom ready to defend the truth she had helped unleash. The battle for the ridge was short and brutal. Sloane didn't fight like a soldier, she fought like an earthquake. She moved with a speed and a violence that the tactical team wasn't prepared for. She used the terrain, the shadows, and the team's own desperation against them. Kaelen stayed back, providing covering fire when she directed him, but he was mostly a witness to the legend. When the last of the tactical team was neutralized and the transport was nothing more than a burning wreck in the pines, Sloane walked back to the cabin door. She wasn't breathing hard. She wasn't bleeding. She just looked at Kaelen and nodded. "The minister is finished. The world knows. Now we vanish." They left the cabin as the first news reports began to flicker on the screens inside, the minister's face frozen in a mask of caught red-handed terror. They moved into the darkness of the woods, two ghosts leaving behind a world that would never be the same. The architect had found his builder, the ghost had found her reason, and the $5 billion deal was nothing more than a footnote in the history of the woman the world's governments feared. Kaelen just chose humanity over the ultimate payday. Would you have kept the $5 billion and stayed quiet, or called a ghost like Sloane for help? Subscribe to stay updated on their escape, and drop a fire emoji below if you're ready for the most intense chase scene in Busan history in the next episode.
The rain isn't just falling, it's a torrential weight, turning the neon lights of the Seomyeong district into bleeding smears of blue and red. Kaelen settled in the passenger seat of a stolen sedan, his knuckles white as he grips the $5 billion drive. In the rearview mirror, 4 black tactical SUVs crest the hill, their engines roaring like predators. They aren't just following, they are calculating. Sloane shifts gears, the car's engine let out a guttural howl. "They've tagged the car's thermal signature," Kaelen rasps, his eyes darting to his tablet. "We have 30 seconds before the bridge lockdown is complete." Sloane doesn't look at him. She looks at the gap between 2 transport trucks ahead. "I don't need 30 seconds, she says, her voice a calm anchor in the chaos. "I need you to hold on."